Hello, everybody. Paul Greene-Dennis here. Welcome back for another live reading session, which I've been doing pretty much throughout the week daily. Yesterday, I did a presidential Black America and the Presidents, chapters 2 and 3, which were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And today, I am picking back up where I left off on One Nation Under Blackmail, Chapter 6, A Private CIA. And One Nation Under Blackmail by Volume 1 by Whitney Webb. And yeah, let's pick back up where we left off with some very juicy details that you're probably not going to get in corporate media, by the way, or another institution, because they refuse to disseminate this. Let's pick back up with the next section of this chapter, which is Bush's Web of Chapter 6, A Private CIA. And just so you know, banner right there. Yeah. Bush's Web of a Private CIA. Journalist Pete Bruton, in his study of the savings and loan crisis, reported on the possibility that another, though perhaps related, private intelligence network was also being formed during this period. The architect of this network was George H.W. Bush. Reportedly, Bush had expressed to Jimmy Carter his willingness to stay on as head of the CIA, only to be rebuffed. Bush subsequently returned to Texas and started anew, alongside his close associates and various business partners. According to one of Bruton's sources, Bush's main ally was William Blakemore II, an oil man rancher hailing from Midland, Texas. Buried deep in the voluminous material compiled as part of an official inquiry into the Iran-Contra affair is Blakemore's name. He served as president of the Gulf and Caribbean Foundation, a philanthropic body used to move funds raised by private donors to the Nicaraguan Contras. Interesting. Another source gave Bruton a different set of names. Walter Mischer, a Houston real estate mogul and banker, and friend of Blakemore, and his son-in-law, Robert Corson. In 1991, Corson was found dead in an El Paso motel after being indicted for money laundering and fraud. You don't say. Those charges connected Corson to a succession of bizarre financial dealings that involved a string of saving and loans, as well as large mainstream banking institutions. Among the sources that Bruton cites is Richard Brennecke, an infamous CIA-adjacent arms dealer and money launderer who became a whistleblower for both the October Surprise and the Iran-Contra affair. According to Brennecke, Bruton writes, Corson worked with him in laundering money for the CIA. Interestingly, Brennecke's money laundering activities were, according to Gordon Thomas, of immense interest to Israeli intelligence, which allegedly studied his methods with the aid of the PROMIS software. PROMIS and Robert Maxwell's intimate involvement in that operation on behalf of Israeli intelligence is discussed in greater detail in Chapter 9. Bruton, meanwhile, further suggests the possibility of Courson's involvement with Israeli intelligence. A Texas law enforcement official who has worked with intelligence agencies confirmed Courson's work for the CIA. This officer said that Courson also did work for the Israelis, but may not have known it, because there were several layers of cutouts between Courson and the Israelis. Wow. Given this possible connection not only to American but Israeli intelligence, there is perhaps significance to the fact that there were direct ties between Walter Mischer and Texas Senator John Tower, the Georgetown Club member whose activities in the late 1980s were intimately intertwined with those of Robert Maxwell. As will be detailed in Chapter 9, Maxwell, an Israeli intelligence asset since the early 1960s, had helped place Tower himself on the payroll of Israel intelligence in the 1980s. Wow. Organized crime here. Mischer's ties to Tower came through Mischer's position as something of a political kingmaker. Mischer, according to press reports, had a virtually unrivaled ability to raise cash for politicians, and he lent his talents to both Democrats and Republicans. While he could often be found backing Democrats like Lloyd Benson, he had also long been a backer of Republican John Tower. Mischer's rise to the lengths of Texan political power came through extensive holdings in construction, manufacturing, real estate, and banking. According to his obituary, Mischer, during World War II, had worked as a project manager at Stone & Webster, a major East Coast engineering concern that had become a major defense contractor that, among other things, designed and built the laboratories utilized for the Manhattan Project. During this time, he worked with the company to construct naval bases in the Caribbean. After the war, he became entangled with a web of development companies, the most important of which was the Mischer Corporation, which he owned until his death. The Mischer Corporation owned thousands of acres of prime development land in the Houston area, while affiliated companies do street paving and sell air conditioning units to home builders. Another Mischer company, organized in partnership with his close friend and colleague Howard L. Terry, was Marathon Manufacturing, which produced heavy industrial equipment. Marathon specialized in oil equipment and offshore drilling platforms, having acquired one of the leading companies in this field, R.G. Letourneur Inc., in 1970. Letourneur's first offshore oil platform had been built for Zapata Petroleum, the CIA-linked oil company founded by George H.W. Bush. In 1979, Marathon was purchased by Penn Central, a company that, along with its then owner, Carl Lindner, will be discussed at length in Chapter 10. As a result, Mischer and Terry ended up with a significant chunk of Penn stock. In 1986, the pair sold their Penn stock to the tune of $106 million. The most important node of the Mischer complex was Allied Bandshares, a sprawling holding company that Mischer controlled and which owned numerous banks across Texas. Misha-controlled and Allied's board was stacked with Misha's close contacts and provides an inside look at his sprawling Old Boys network, a network quite possibly utilized by Bush after his ouster as CIA director. Among Allied's board members was the aforementioned Howard Terry, as was Gerald Smith, who was something of Misha's right-hand man. Smith's own banking interests extended beyond Texas and into Louisiana, with apparent ties to organized crime and intelligence. Smith was co-owner of a bank with Herman Beebe, the SNL fraudster and mob insider discussed earlier in this chapter. Beebe's own networks of banks and SNLs were reportedly financed with heavy loans from Allied. During the 1980s, Allied's co-chairman was one of Misha's longtime associates, Houston investor Jack T. Trotter. Trotter is described in the 1987 issue of Texas Monthly as having been a behind-the-scenes player in the setting the course of the Houston business community, with an enormous network of people he has made rich by his deals. Trotter maintained a decades-long business relationship with the powerful Duncan family, lorded over by the patriarch John H. Duncan Sr. Duncan Sr., in the late 1960s, was a director of the Bank of the Southwest, the Texas banking institution discussed in the previous chapter as being linked to a number of CIA funding conduits. Trotter and the Duncan family embarked on a number of business ventures with Gerald D. Hines, another Houston developer and Misha associate whose impact on Houston can be seen in his ambitious construction projects, including the headquarters of Shell and Pennzoil, as well as the Galleria shopping district, a location that, as we will see in the next chapter, may have played a role in land speculation schemes linked to Iran-Contra. Perhaps significantly, Hines will be encountered again in Columbus, Ohio, as the developer and owner of the building where Leslie Wexner parked his tangled web of real estate and other holding companies, including companies that were mentioned by Columbus police in connection with the murder of his company's tax attorney. A final Allied director worth mentioning is George A. Butler, then the senior partner at the powerful Houston law firm of Butler, Binyah, Rice, Cook, and Knapp. Alongside Trotter, he maintained a spot on the board of the Gulf Resources and Chemical Corporation of Houston. Gulf Resources had been founded with the aid of Joseph Patton, a general partner at Bear Stearns. Another Bear Stearns partner named Raphael Bernstein maintained a place on the Gulf board well into the 1980s. Considered a major national security concern due to the role it had played in producing the bulk of the U.S. lithium supply, essential for, among other things, nuclear weapons, Gulf Resources achieved notoriety in the 1970s when the company's president, Robert H. Allen, smuggled funds via a Mexican subsidiary and bank to Nixon's Committee for the Re-election of the President. What? These funds were then utilized by the plumbers to finance the Watergate break-ins. Allen would, at one time, serve as the campaign finance chair for one of John Tower's Senate campaigns. The movement of the Gulf Resources money towards its ultimate destination was largely facilitated by Bill Liedtke, the founder and president of Pennzoil, along with his brother J. Hugh Liedtke. Bill was one of George H.W. Bush's original business partners. They had formed part of the original group that created Zapata Petroleum. In 1959, Bush and the Liedtkes decided to split Zapata into two companies, with one half becoming Zapata Offshore and the other half becoming Pennzoil. A 1976 Senate Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs report lists Bill Liedtke as a director of the Bank of Texas. This was almost certainly the Continental Bank of Texas, headquartered in the Gerald Hines-designed Shell Plaza in Houston, which had been formed in 1973 through a merger between Continental Bank and the Bank of Texas. Wow. The president of the merged bank was Gerald Smith, while the chairman was George Butler. The presence of these two Mr. cronies is no accident, as Continental Bank of Texas was operating under the umbrella of Allied Bandshares. At the time that Bush was purported to have been organizing his own private intelligence web, he was also making his own forays into the world of banking. On February 23, 1977, the New York Times reported that he had been elected a director of First International Bandshares, a large Houston bank holding company. At the same time, he was appointed to the board of his largest holding, First International Bank, and its London Merchant Bank subsidiary, First National Bandshares Limited Bank, Russ Baker. In his history of the Bush family Limited, Russ Baker, in his history of the Bush family, would at one time serve as the campaign finance chair for one of John Tower's Senate campaigns. The movement of the Gulf resources money towards, let me repeat that last sentence. Russ Baker, in his history of the Bush family, writes that First International was not your friendly neighborhood bank. Rather, it was a Texas powerhouse whose principles reached well beyond banking into the netherworld of intelligence and intrigue. It was particularly close to Saudi interests, which at the time were investing heavily in Houston real estate and industry, a byproduct of Texas oil interests taking hold in the Middle East and the Gulf states. FIB reportedly held a revolving line of credit for Saddam bin Laden, while multiple sources have linked it to the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, a powerful and deeply corrupt institution detailed in the next chapter. Joe L. Arberton, the longtime chairman of Washington, D.C.'s Riggs Bank, maintained a post as director of First International. Riggs was described by the Wall Street Journal as having had a long-standing relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency and maintained accounts for a number of infamous figures. Among these was Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador to the United States from 1983 to 2005, whose contact information would later appear in Jeffrey Epstein's contact book. In early 2005, Riggs pleaded guilty to money laundering charges resulting from an extensive Justice Department inquiry into the bank's activities. Sitting alongside Bush and Arberton on the board of First International was John Murchison of the Murchison oil family. John Murchison was less known than his counterparts, Clint Murchison Sr. and Jr., but was by no means less prolific when it came to oil and gas holdings and other business concerns. Interestingly, in 1982, John's son, John Murchison Jr., was appointed to the board of Gulf Resources and Chemical Corporation, following the firm's takeover by a shadowy British businessman turned tax exile in Switzerland named Alan Clory. First International appears to have been closely linked to Lintemcovot Ltd., a major Dallas-based defense contractor that provided the U.S. military with, among other things, light attack aircraft during the Vietnam War. John Murchison was listed among the directors of LTV, as was the independent oilman Edwin L. Cox, also found on the board of First International. In 1970, LTV's board was run by a prominent Texas businessman named Robert H. Stewart III, who 2 years later would organize First International as a holding company for First National Bank and serve as the institution's long-running chairman. Much like Walter Mischer, Stewart was incredibly connected both economically and politically. The 1970 New York Times announcement of his takeover of the LTV board notes that Senator John Tower was his very good friend. That same article attributes the following quote to Stewart. "I've always been on the conservative side of politics. Some people refer to me as being a little to the right of Louis XIV. He maintained positions on the boards of numerous major corporations, including a position as a director at Pepsi from 1965 through at least 1995. Between the 1960s and the 1970s, he was affiliated with Braniff Airways, which for a time was a subsidiary of LTV. During the 1980s, Smisher served on the board of this same aviation company. One important corporate connection for Stewart was his presence at ARCO, formerly known as Atlantic Richfield, in the 1980s. Wow, he is everywhere. This was the petroleum company of Robert O. Anderson, a close associate of the Rockefeller family who spent time at the Council on Foreign Relations at the same time as George H.W. Bush. The precise relationship between Anderson and Bush is hard to pin down, but one telling episode involves Atlantic Richfield's role in developing the expansive Trans-Alaskan pipeline system. Service for Anderson's companies was provided by the aviation companies of Phil Burt, which included Interior Airways and later Alaska International. In 1974, a young George W. Bush traveled to Fairbanks, Alaska, where he took a job working for Burt. When asked by Russ Baker how exactly the younger Bush came to be in his employ, Burt stated that it was as a favor to someone from a Houston construction firm. This becomes all the more curious when considering Burt's claims that Alaska International became embroiled in intelligence work after the election of President Carter. In other words, right when Bush was purported to have been setting up his intelligence network. These were off-the-books operations, Burt told Baker, after Jimmy Carter went in, gutted the CIA, and almost ruined them. He further alleged that his connection to the agency persisted into the Reagan administration, and that his company had provided support to Southern Air Transport during the Contra years. Who was the individual from the Houston construction firm that brought W. Bush to Burt's attention? It's impossible to say, but one possibility is that it was Walter Mischer himself. Nothing directly linking the two men has yet been found, but they both shared a mutual association with Robert O. Anderson. In the early 1950s, Mischer began accumulating land near Lajitas, a small town in West Texas near the U.S.-Mexico border, and Anderson followed suit in the 1960s by setting up his Big Bend Ranch. What? In the early 1980s, the two joined forces, with Anderson selling half of the ranch's ownership to Mischer, with big plans to syndicate the land and sell shares to selected colleagues in the Texas establishment. Throughout this whole period, Anderson maintained an intriguing business contact. Claremont Club member Tiny Rowland, a figure that, as will be discussed later in this chapter and elsewhere in this book, was tied to American and Israeli intelligence services and played a rather murky role in the Iran-Contra affair. First introduced by the shadowy tanker magnate and billionaire Daniel K. Ludwig, Anderson had sold his ownership of the British Observer to Rowland in 1983. Several years later, Anderson departed Arco to focus on his private company, Hondo Oil and Gas. According to the New York Times, the company was equally owned by Mr. Anderson and the British conglomerate Lorno plc, a global corporate empire overseen by Rowland. There's a lot of tentacles being formed in this private CIA, and we have to get to the next section of this very dense, like I said, chapter of a private CIA. The Safari Club. In his book on the Shackley-Wilson Private CIA, Joseph Trento describes how this ensemble of quasi-official intelligence operatives forged a working partnership with a shadowy covert apparatus known as the Safari Club. This was a meeting space for the heads of numerous intelligence agencies that were allied with the United States in those increasingly heated days of the Cold War. Organizers of the club included Kamal Adam, the director of Saudi intelligence, as well as his nephew and successor, Turki bin Faisal al Saud. Accompanying them was General Nasiri, head of Iran's SAVAK, Ahmed Doulemi, the Moroccan intelligence director, and Alexandre de Mareches, the head of France's Service de Documentation Extérieure et de Congrès Espagnol. Let me just read the English, that what it is in English. External Documentation and Counter-Espionage Service of SDECE. The motivating factor for the club's formation was similar to that which had spawned Shackley's group. The rise of a reformist tendency within U.S. intelligence and the political system at large limited the ability of the CIA to operate as it once had. It was into that void that the Safari Club hoped to step. Turki bin Faisal discussed the club and its activities during a speech at Georgetown University. In 1976, after the Watergate matters took place here, your intelligence community was literally tied up by Congress. It could not do anything. It could not send spies. It could not write reports. And it could not pay money. In order to compensate for that, a group of countries got together in the hope of fighting communism and established what was called the Safari Club. The Safari Club included France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Iran. The principal aim of this club was that we would share information with each other and help each other in countering Soviet influence worldwide, and especially in Africa. Iranian journalist Mohammed Hakel, in Iran, The Untold Story, describes how bin Faisal's remarks reflected the development of a series of critical geopolitical alignments that had been emerging since the early 1970s. The Saudi and Iranian governments were both turning toward Africa as a source of raw materials and as an emerging market. For them, there was a need to curb the influence of the Soviet Union on the continent, which was then being felt throughout the myriad of blossoming anti-colonial movements. These movements challenged the continued dominance of European powers, particularly that of France, whose African interests encompassed a global trade in uranium, diamonds, and gold. As a result, a triangular relationship began to take shape. The backbone of the club involved not only intelligence sharing, but also economic arrangements that parlayed into a lucrative arms trade. Egypt became a hotbed of Safari Club activity, with Cairo featuring its first operations center. This center was equipped to evaluate what was going on in Africa, identifying the danger spots, and to make recommendations for dealing with them. At the same time, Saudi Arabia was lending its Egyptian allies large sums of money, which were then used to purchase French-produced weapons that soon flooded African conflict zones. Given that the Saudis provided the financing, Trento writes, they effectively ran the show. In order to function properly, the Safari Club required a banking apparatus to marshal and direct its economic resources. The vehicle of choice was the colossus of dark money and offshore finance known as the Bank of Credit and Commercial International. Discussed at length in the next chapter. While nominally a Pakistani merchant bank, BCCI was also backed by the Saudi Intelligence Directorate, which in turn was closely integrated with the country's ruling elite. Likewise, BCCI maintained branches across Europe and the Middle East. In Cairo, a pivotal city for the Safari Club, the Egyptian branch of the Arab International Bank operated as a BCCI affiliate. The Arab International Bank curiously appears as a footnote, albeit perhaps a significant one, in the history of the U.S. savings and loan crisis. Employed at this offshore bank for some time as treasurer was Mario Renda, later renowned for depositing a flood of money from Teamsters Union locals in New York City into various thrifts across the United States. Here we go again, Teamsters. Many of them were intimately intertwined with organized crime, and many also subsequently collapsed. According to the testimony of Colombo family Lieutenant Lawrence Llorizo, Renda handling business for Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family. Prior to these interesting career turns, Renda had formed a business partnership with a man who was no stranger to the world of the BCCI, arms deals, and the shadowy intelligence networks at large, Adnan Khashoggi. The Safari Club owed much to Khashoggi. The name of the group had come from its first meeting place, the Mount Kenya Safari Club in Nanyuki, Kenya, where Khashoggi had purchased in the mid-1970s. Once a hangout of the older generation of Hollywood stars, the international jet set, and a slick-heeled group of globe-trotting American mobsters. The hotel and its surrounding acres had been purchased by the arms dealer for a mere $900,000. Among Khashoggi's first acts was to dial up the location's exclusivity. Press reports from the time allude to his plans to close the resort and use it all for himself. This wasn't exactly accurate. Khashoggi's plans, it seems, was to market the facility to an even more select clientele and to use it as a private meeting place for the sorts of figures who inhabited the same strange netherworld. Notably, Khashoggi was not the first intelligence-linked figure to be involved with the Mount Kenya Safari Club. Most accounts of the club note that its rise had been facilitated by its owners, William Holden, the actor and close friend of Ronald Reagan, and Ray Ryan, a professional gambler and businessman with extensive ties to the hoodlum element. They had acquired the properties around 1960, but a year earlier, they had visited the club in the company of columnist Robert Ruark, whose syndicated newspaper writings framed him as an international adventurer with a strong taste for the exotic, and Ruark's good friend Ricardo Sicra. As Ruark tells it, he and Sicra had convinced Holden and Ryan to purchase the Safari Club. During World War II, Sicra had served in the OSS, participating in the North African and Mediterranean theaters in a covert group under the direction of Frank Ryan. Outside of the world of intelligence, Ryan had been a prominent businessman involved in several import-export firms with a focus on textiles. These business skills came in handy after the war, when veterans of the OSS and the British intelligence apparatus, and a number of British merchant banks, Canadian industrialists, and U.S. financiers formed the World Commerce Corporation, WCC. Ryan served as the WCC's president and Sicra as its vice president. While the WCC remains largely unknown, there has been increased interest in its activities, and various writers and researchers have emphasized different aspects of the corporation. Hold on. Let me get a swag. Most focus on its function as a commercial cover for intelligence activities, while others, such as Stephen Snyder, have assessed the WCC in terms of the special relationship that exists between the U.S. and the UK. Anthony Cave Brown, the biographer of OSS founder and head William Donovan, one of the primary movers behind the scenes of the WCC, links the firm to efforts to rebuild European industry in the aftermath of World War II, while Ralph Gaines parses out the linkages between the WCC and the construction of the industrial infrastructure for NATO. When the WCC was first created, it was reported that its purpose was to bring an end the dollar shortages of the post-war era. Such a task was vital for the formation of an international economic order that was to be led by the U.S. and its European allies, with holdings and interests in mining, oil, natural gas, film, shipping, agriculture, and tourism. The WCC did indeed pursue this goal. Was the Holden Rhine development of the Mount Kenya Safari Club carried out at the encouragement of the WCC's Vice President Ricardo Secra part of this international dollar recycling effort? The idea is not as outrageous as it might sound. As early as 1945, President Roosevelt and Juan Trippe, the founder of Pan American World Airways, were locked in discussions about the role international tourism and luxury resorts would play in attracting dollars to the developing world. Trippe was the brother-in-law of Edward Stettinius Jr., President Roosevelt's Secretary of State, who had a spot on the WCC board until his untimely death in 1949. To accomplish the goals he had conceived with Roosevelt, Trippe organized intercontinental hotels. Decades later, Adnan Khashoggi tapped Intercontinental to manage the Safari Club. Scratching the surface of Khashoggi's own Safari Club takeover also reveals the presence of intelligence assets. He had been introduced to the club by his public relations manager, Edward K. Moss, who had been a longtime member. Moss was also working as a consultant for the Kenyan government, while Khashoggi had his own business in the country. He was privy to the details of a planned beach resort and a World Bank study that projected millions of dollars for the area. These various strands converged at the Safari Club. As his biographer writes, Khashoggi felt that the locale was a Shangri-La. As far back as 1962, Moss had connections to the CIA. That year, he was cleared for ZR Major, a CIA operation that entailed the exploitation of political consultants. While few details exist as to the exact purpose of the operation, it was run by the political action group of the Covert Action Staff, which in turn was overseen by Cord Meyer. It was not Moss's first encounter with the agency. A handwritten memo states that he had obtained a covert security approval in 1959. Yet another CIA document refers to Moss as acting as the assistant for raising funds against Castro and for public relations matters to Tony Varona, the leader of the CIA-backed Cuba Revolutionary Council. Verona is not only known for being one of the CIA's chief assets in their covert wars against Castro's Cuba. He was also one of several figures who were connected to the agency and organized crime figures Santo Trafficante and John Roselli. Here we go again, more into webs of organized crime and supposedly legitimate government. CIA files make it abundantly clear that Moss was working deeply within this nexus where organized crime and intelligence mixed. The aforementioned handwritten memo alludes to Moss's long-standing mafia connection before noting that his operation seems to be government contracts for the underworld and probably surfaces mafia money in legitimate business activities. The Moss file reports a rumor that Julia Cellini, sister of Dino Cellini, was Moss's mistress and operated a secretarial service that was in reality a front for Edward K. Moss's activities. Moss, furthermore, moved money from Dino Cellini to Verona, yet another clear example of CIA organized crime collusion. Throughout the 1950s, Cellini was Meyer Lansky's point man in Cuba and helped manage several major national crime syndicate casinos, the Riviera Casino and the Tropicana Club. As noted in the last chapter, Cellini's activities brought him into close contact with Charles Torrini and Joe Nesline. Peter Dale Scott points out that this nexus raises the specter of human trafficking and the deployment of sex as a means of political influence. The Cellini siblings were described in FBI files as active participants in the trade of narcotics and white slavery rackets. Scott adds that this FBI report suggests an important shared interest between Moss and Khashoggi: sexual corruption. More on Khashoggi's alleged role in sexual blackmail is discussed in the next chapter as well as Chapter 11. Incredibly, the source of the information linking Moss to organized crime was none other than Edwin Wilson. A CIA internal memo drafted in 1973 states, Wilson stated that he had met Moss in 1963 through Frank O'Connell, Washington representative of the Transport Workers Union. The memorandum also suggests that one of Wilson's business associates, Richard S. Cobb, was also having business contacts with Moss. Wilson stated that subsequent investigations surfaced from business analysis firm Dun & Bradstreet and a verbal report from Dun & Bradstreet recognizing Moss's long-standing mafia connections. Moss's operation seems to be government contracts for the underworld and probably surfaces mafia money in legitimate business activities. One cannot help but wonder if 1966 was really the earliest encounter between Wilson and Moss. As mentioned earlier, Wilson's early tenure in the agency included a long stint operating under the auspices of the CIA's work with the AFL-CIO, which was overseen by Cord Meyer's International Operations Division. In March 1962, the International Operations Division merged with the Covert Action Staff, with Meyer maintaining control of both. The Covert Action Staff under Meyer was, as previously mentioned, the wing of the CIA that oversaw ZR Major, the operation that Moss had been cleared for. It is certainly plausible that Wilson and Moss crossed paths at this earlier stage. Further indications of the close-knit nature of this network of individuals comes through JM Wave, the Miami station that oversaw the Cuban exile operations to which Moss was also connected. Shackley and Klein's, Wilson's closest CIA contacts, spent considerable time there. Let me take another drink. This entire complex was hidden away in the shadows. Through Shackley, the Safari Club was linked with powerful forces within the domestic opposition to Carter. The president himself, writes Trento, had never been briefed on the Safari Club. This was despite advancing corruption within his own administration, as evidenced by certain Carter officials, such as Clark Clifford, playing a fundamental role in BCCI's penetration of the U.S. banking system. By 1980, elements interwoven through the Safari Club network and Shackley's private CIA were mounting international opposition to Carter, laying the groundwork for the arrival of soon-to-become President Ronald Reagan. Critical to this effort was a series of meetings held by Le Cercle, a quasi-formal group composed of representatives from conservative military, intelligence, and business circles in NATO countries. Since its inception in the 1950s, Le Cercle had been carefully nurtured by U.S., British, and French intelligence assets in tandem with German and Italian industrialists. The upcoming U.S. election was a topic of conversation at a June 1980 Le Cercle meeting held in Zurich, with the minutes making reference to the shattered remains of Carter's foreign policy and a discussion about a series of appropriate measures to promote the electoral campaign of presidential candidate Reagan against Carter. Among those attending this Le Cercle meeting was Donald Jameson, an old CIA hand who had retired to take a job at Tetra Tech, a contractor with extensive ties in the Middle East. Tetra Tech, which was suspected by authorities of being tied to BCCI, had been founded by another CIA veteran, James Critchfield. Both Critchfield and Jameson were close to Shackley, and both were attached to his Research International Associates, a key node in the private CIA network. Several days after this Le Cercle meeting, another participant, Brian Crozier, who coincidentally answered for many years to Meyer in the Covert Action Staff, met personally with Ronald Reagan in Los Angeles. Shortly thereafter, the French intelligence chief, Alexandre de Marenches, met with Reagan's new campaign manager, William Casey, in Paris. David Teacher, in his lengthy study of Le Cercle, points out that this meeting occurred a month prior to the infamous meetings in Madrid that are suspected to have led to the infamous October surprise plot, whereby representatives in Reagan's campaign are said to have conspired with Iran to delay the release of hostages until after the 1980 election in order to influence the election's outcome. Teacher states, de Marenches was well placed to advise Casey on the Iranian hostage crisis. He had been the driving force behind the creation of the Safari Club, founded in 1976 to coordinate covert operations between the French, Iranian, Saudi, and Egyptian intelligence services. Next section of this heavy chapter, and a crazy chapter too. Casey's early wars. William Casey is best remembered as the hawkish director of the CIA during the final stage of the Cold War, an individual who, to some, strove to reorient the agency away from the direction it had taken under the Carter administration and, to others, somebody who permanently stained the agency with the mark of scandal. It was under Casey's watch that the so-called Iranian-Contra affair, a misnomer, designed to conceal the Reagan administration's drive toward global covert warfare, flourished. By the time he died in early May 1987 from a fast-moving brain tumor, the scandal had broken wide open, and one by one, his former colleagues, underlings, and frontmen were being called to testify. Casey's story, however, started long before Oliver North and Richard Secord arrived on the scene. It began with his education under the Jesuits at Fordham University in New York City, which had kindled a lifelong animosity towards anything that bore the faintest hint of socialism and an affinity for the Knights of Malta, to which he belonged. According to Leo Schern, who later led the CIA-financed International Rescue Committee, Casey was a prototypical Cold Warrior by the 1930s. Bill, from the beginning, was to the right of Attila the Hun, said Schern. When it came to the conflict unfolding in Spain, Casey was 100% for Franco. To understand this, you had to understand his Catholicism. Schern's early acquaintance with Casey had come through the Research Institute of America, an economic analysis and publishing venture both were involved with. While the RIA strove to be nonpartisan, Casey deeply opposed the Roosevelt administration's New Deal. The policies, he felt, smacked of socialistic impulses and restrained the free functioning of the private sector. This political orientation opened doors for Casey in certain circles of New York politics, while the analytic capabilities he had honed in the RIA opened others. In the short term, however, he worked at the law practice he had formed with his friend Jerry Doran called Backer, Casey, Doran, and Siegel. When that did not pan out, he went to work at the Board of Economic Warfare. The Board of Economic Warfare was one of many Byzantine wartime bureaucracies that had been created to deal with the immense logistical quandaries posed by a truly global war effort. Casey joined the organization in September 1942 as a consultant, but he quickly grew bored with it. He then found himself in the Navy and was detailed to the Office of Naval Procurement, where he carried out basically the same tasks he had at the Board of Economic Warfare. Then he began to hear rumors about the Office of Strategic Service, led by William Donovan. As luck would have it, Jerry Doran had joined up with Donovan's law firm. Through this contact, Casey was able to arrange a meeting with Otto Deering, Donovan's right-hand man at the OSS, and also a senior partner at Donovan's law firm. Casey soon found himself in London, the base for all OSS operations in Europe. The OSS London station was overseen by David K. E. Bruce. Much has been made of the close-knit relationship between the OSS and the moneyed elite, America's practical aristocracy populated by dynasties such as the Mellons, Harrimans, DuPonts, and Morgans. Bruce, too, was a product of this world. He was married to Elsa Mellon of the prominent Pittsburgh family. Paul Mellon, Alice's brother, served in London under Bruce. Although Ailsa Mellon and David Bruce divorced in 1945, Bruce seems to have stayed in contact with the family. During the early days of his tenure as U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, he was acquainted with one of the family's young heirs, William Mellon Hitchcock. As noted in Chapter 4, both would play a role in the Profumo affair. Nominally, Casey was a rank-and-file member of the Secretariat, a cog in the intelligence machinery who spent his time drafting reports to be passed to the upper brass. Perhaps because of Casey's experience in bureaucracy and background in research and analysis, or perhaps because of his economic ambitions, Casey and Bruce developed a close working relationship that propelled the future CIA director far beyond the ground floor of the OSS. Through Bruce, he was promoted to the service's inner sanctum, the elite social matrix that made up the center of power within the intelligence apparatus. Soon, Casey was granted the title of Chief of the OSS Secretariat in the European Theater of Operations, a position that made him Donovan's troubleshooter on the continent. Another well-connected OSS man at the London station, who later inherited Bruce's position, was J. Russell Forgan. Forgan hailed from the high finance circles of Chicago. His father, David R. Forgan, and his uncle, James B. Forgan, served as presidents of the First National Bank of Chicago. Investors in this historic institution included Morgan and Harriman Interest and James Stillman, a close ally of the Rockefeller family. James Forgan had also served on the first board of the Federal Reserve. Russell Forgan followed in his family's footsteps and ingratiated himself with the world of Chicago banking. Then, abruptly, in the mid-1940s, as World War II rumbled to a close, he and William Casey found themselves tasked with a very different kind of business. As Joseph Periscoe notes, General Donovan summoned his senior staff and told them that this war had forever ended the isolation of the United States. He directed an OSS colonel, J. Russell Forgan, to head up a committee, as he put it, to study the need for our country to establish on a permanent basis, as an integral part of the military, a strategic intelligence agency. Bill Casey was to serve as the committee's secretary. The assignment was to bring Casey in at the creation of what would ultimately metamorph into the Central Intelligence Agency. As he would tell his staff at Langley 37 years later, I was there in the beginning. Nobody saw me, but I was there. After the war, Casey continued to inhabit intelligence, military, and defense circles. This can be seen in his often overlooked role in co-founding a national security think tank called the National Strategy Information Center, NSIC, in 1962. The NSIC was essentially an offshoot of a National Security Council propaganda outfit called the Institution for American Strategy, as evidenced by NSIC's co-founder, Frank Barnett, having served there as program director. Good Lord. The NSIC maintained a presence in intelligence circles over the years and through Casey's time as CIA director. It accumulated familiar faces on its board of directors, including Thomas Moorer. Likewise, NSCI seminars on special operations and Cold War geopolitical activities were attended by such people as Ted Shackley and Oliver North. When he wasn't running Cold War propaganda organizations or practicing law, Casey spent his days pursuing a future in politics. He planted himself firmly in the wing of the Republican Party that was opposed to the Nelson and David Rockefeller centrist faction. His sympathies were with the so-called fiscal conservatives and the militant anti-communists. He was in alignment with Roy Cohn's good friend William F. Buckley and his National Review, even going so far as to ghostwrite an anti-Rockefeller essay for the paper. The thrust of Bill's article, Buckley later said, was that Rockefeller wanted to lead New York State and then America away from anti-communism and towards collectivism. Okay. The political vehicle that Casey ultimately hitched himself to was Richard Nixon. Nixon, he reasoned, was a figure far removed from the sort of Eastern establishment's cultural circles that had fostered politicians like Nelson Rockefeller. Furthermore, Nixon was an avid Cold Warrior and a friend of business. Casey went to work in an unofficial capacity for Nixon's ill-fated campaign against John F. Kennedy. While these efforts bore little fruit, he continued to spend the 1960s aiding Nixon's advance and turning down offers to work on the campaigns of Barry Goldwater and others. Nixon's resurgence at the end of the 1960s was Casey's moment. He dumped money into the Nixon campaign's coffers and worked to organize a book called Nixon on the Issues. He had expected that, in return for his efforts, the incoming administration would grant him some high-value position, but the long-awaited offer never came. Instead, Casey resorted to calling on go-betweens to help him find a position. Thank you. One of these was his old OSS colleague, J. Russell Forgan, who was close to Maurice Stans, Nixon's financial manager and the eventual head of the Committee for the Re-election of the President. From 1965 to 1969, Stans had served as president of Glory Forgan, a prominent New York investment house led in part by Russell Forgan. Casey's vision was singular and hewed closely to his geopolitical bona fides. He wanted a position at the top of the armed forces pyramid, or in the State Department or the CIA. When he finally got an offer from Nixon, it was as deputy director of the CIA, a position beneath Director Richard Helms, and Casey rejected it. According to Casey biographer Joseph Perisco, the offer bordered on insult. Dick Helms worked for Casey more than 25 years ago. He had been a junior officer in London when Casey was U.S. intelligence chief for all of Europe. He was equally reluctant about the next offer, but he eventually accepted it. As a result, in 1971, he became the head of the Nixon administration's Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. He held that post for 2 years before holding a series of other positions, including that of Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, where he butted heads with Henry Kissinger, as chairman for the Import-Export Bank and a spot on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. It is worth pausing for a moment, however, to examine Casey's tenure at the SEC, because it was there that he crossed paths with the infamous financial bandit Robert Vesco. Which leads us to the next part of this chapter, next section of this chapter, the Detroit Kid. Robert Vesco was one of the greats in the world of white-collar crime. He was renowned for his rapid rise, and his subsequent fall, which forced him to become a country-hopping, yet incredibly wealthy fugitive who courted right-wing paramilitaries, Colombian cartels, and Cuban communists with equal ease. He was something of an enigma. Mitchell Werbel III, the old OSS China hand, who had become a gun-for-hire and arms merchant, suspected Vesco of being a CIA asset. He was described by Jim Hogan in his classic book, Spooks, as Watergate's own Rosetta Stone. His meteoric rise was fueled by his takeover and subsequent looting of an international mutual fund that was at the very least adjacent to both organized crime and the CIA. Not satisfied, he then tried to take control of Resorts International, the notorious Paradise Island hotel and casino that was tied to these exact same organized crime and intelligence network. Wow. The initial object of Vesco's takeover and looting was Investors Overseas Services, IOS, the brainchild of the hippie entrepreneur, B'nai B'rith activist, and self-proclaimed Trotskyite Bernie Cornfield. On the surface, IOS was a peddler of mutual funds, with his salesmen traveling door to door across Europe and elsewhere, hawking their products. These were modest beginnings for something that later became a global octopus. Even before Vesco's advent on the scene, writes Hogan, IOS bordered on the bizarre. It was an underground institution, the financial equivalent of Thomas Pynchon's Five. R.T. Naylor, an expert on offshore finance, sums up IOS. If Bernie Cornfield did not invent the modern technology of capital flight, he did far more than his contemporaries to put it to work in an imaginative, systematic, and profitable way. As Naylor points out, IOS's early successes were made possible by U.S.-led economic policies. On the one hand, the status of the dollar as a reserve currency had opened up the nascent euro-dollar markets and created the need for dollar recycling. IOS fit nicely into each. On the other hand, there was the IMF's encouragement for developing countries to loosen controls on capital flows. The flight of capital from these countries often saw that capital going right into investments in the United States and Europe, as well as into other developing zones. The IMF's policies often created a business boom, though not necessarily in the countries it was professing to help. And Cornfield capitalized on these and related policies to turn IOS and its web of mutual funds into a veritable sponge for soaking up all of this now available capital. IOS salesmen and other couriers descended on developing countries, crisscrossed war zones, and forged alliances with dictators, offering investment opportunities and access to bank accounts in Luxembourg, Geneva, and the Bahamas. In managing this ever-ballooning mass of hot money, Cornfield and iOS cultivated a close working relationship with a very peculiar banker, Tibor Rosenbaum. As previously mentioned, the Geneva-based Money Man's International Credit Bank was a favored repository for the funds of both Meyer Lansky and the Mossad. Rosenbaum even went so far as to take credit for being the person who first pointed out the benefits of a mutual fund scheme to Cornfield. The result was the creation of iOS's first major financial entity, the International Investment Trust, which launched in 1962. Rosenbaum was not the only figure involved with Mossad that Cornfield had buddied up with. There was also Bruce Rappaport, the banker, tanker magnate, and financial criminal, who was among William Casey's closest friends. According to criminologist Alan Block, Rappaport once bailed Cornfield out of jail in Switzerland. Importantly, iOS was supported by Bank van Emden, which owned a portion of Rappaport's own banking complex, Intermaritime Bank. Oh my God, he you could say he's like the big Genesis. And you're right, his name was in the mentioned throughout the book since the very beginning of this book. You could argue he's like the big Don Dada, the original of the genesis of what we know as organized crime, and also organized crime sprawling, becoming, my opinion, the government. In October 1970, Block notes, British bankers discovered that Bank van Emden was either a subsidiary or an affiliate of Banque Office Occidentale, owned by James Goldsmith, the Claremont Club member, corporate raider, and another figure who would later appear repeatedly in the nexus that later surrounded Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. While iOS was rapidly expanding internationally, an unrelated corporate complex, the International Controls Corporation, was carrying out a series of rapid acquisitions in the United States. At the helm of ICC was Robert Vesco. Vesco's main tactic was to borrow money to finance takeovers and then use the assets of the captured companies to pay off the loans. This ensured a stellar credit rating, and with a few strategic moves, Vesco was soon offering shares of his newly minted empire on the stock exchange. Vesco, known as the Detroit Kid, targeted troubled mid-sized industrial outfits for his early acquisitions. One of his first ventures was Captive Seal, a manufacturer of parts for missile technology. The company had been floundering, but Vesco managed to turn it around by courting an investment capital firm called H.H. Industries, a co-owner of which was Baron Edmund de Rothschild. To illustrate the incestuous nature of these business networks, this was the same Baron Rothschild who had organized the Israel Corporation, Israel's largest investment company, designed to encourage large-scale private investment in Israel, with none other than Tibor Rosenbaum. It seems to have been the Rothschild connection that put iOS on Vesco's radar sometime between 1967 and 1968. According to Arthur Herzog, Vesco's biographer, Baron Rothschild had bragged to Henry Buell III, then the newly minted president of the International Investment Trust, of the successes of Captive Seal. Shortly thereafter, George Carlweiss, an agent of Edmond de Rothschild's Banque Privée, brokered an introduction of Vesco to Buell. From there, it was off to the races. At Buell's discretion, iOS began to purchase ICC shares. Vesco was being propelled upward. The Detroit Kid made his move when iOS began to feel a liquidity crunch. There was a certain irony to this. While iOS controlled an unfathomable sum of money, it was not always readily accessible for above-board economic purposes. Vesco offered to bail out iOS in exchange for a high degree of control over the company. What happened next was described by Jim Hogan as a masterpiece of unarmed robbery. A newly created Bahamian subsidiary of International Controls, ICC Investments Incorporated, was the lender to iOS. What Vesco did was have ICC Investments borrow $5 million from a Wall Street brokerage house, the money to be repaid in 6 weeks. He then convinced the owner of Butler's Bank in the Bahamas, also undergoing a liquidity crisis, to lend ICC Investments $5 million to repay the 6-week loan. From here, Vesco structured the loan agreement to iOS so that it would extend the $5 million to ease the liquidity crunch, minus $350,000, which was used to cover the financing cost of the Wall Street brokerage. With the remaining money, Vesco took control of iOS and then directed the company to repay the loan that had been taken from Butler's Bank. Vesco, in other words, had used iOS's own funds to finance its takeover. That is cold blood. Next, he began to systematically purge the board of older cornfield loyalists and effectively consolidated control over one of the world's largest offshore financial institutions. Finally, through a bizarre web of shell companies and fronts, organized with iOS money, Vesco began to sell off iOS assets, call in debts, and simply pocket large sums of money. The systematic looting of iOS quickly caught the attention of Stanley Sporkin, head of the SEC's Enforcement Division. The way that Sporkin has told the story, the resulting SEC investigation was a noble effort that had been greenlit by his boss, William Casey. The SEC began to freeze Vesco's accounts abroad, with the goal of slowing the torrents of money that were flowing out of iOS and, by extension, the pockets of those who had bought iOS mutual funds. Yet these successes were short-lived. There was the matter of a $250,000 campaign contribution Vesco had made to Nixon's campaign for the re-election of the president. Incredibly, a portion of this contribution was used to finance the Watergate break-ins. Almost immediately, Casey began to pump the brakes on Sporkin's efforts. Vesco, meanwhile, sought a one-on-one meeting with Casey. Questions have been raised regarding Casey's impartiality when it came to the iOS. The reason for this was a strange little company he had been involved with, starting in 1968, that was called Multiponics. The company would follow Casey like a ghost and rear its head to taunt him again and again. Multiponics, formerly named Ivanhoe Associates, was ostensibly organized to engage in farming operations, agribusiness, and the acquisition of land. A mere 3 years after it launched, Multiponics was bankrupt with hints of suspect activity everywhere. The company, for example, had acquired the mortgage debts of all its organizers, Casey's included. Multiponics investors were never informed of this function of the company. Nevertheless, the money they had put into Multiponics shares inevitably went, without their knowledge or consent, into paying down these mortgage debts. Helping to organize the Multiponics stock offering was none other than Glory Forgan, the firm of Casey's old OSS comrade, J. Russell Forgan. Lawrence F. Orb, an advisor in the corporate finance department of Glory Forgan, maintained a spot on the board of Multiponics. The primary investor in Multiponics just so happened to be International Investment Trusts, the leading mutual fund of iOS. What this meant is that Casey, as head of the SEC and the person ultimately in charge of the investigation into Vesco, had business interests that were intimately interwoven throughout Vesco's affairs. There is little doubt that Vesco understood the precarious position that Casey was in. It was later revealed that while he had sought a back channel to Casey, he had also been preparing potential legal action against him. The purpose of Multiponics, Vesco argued, had been to take over the personal interests of Mr. Casey and others in certain farming operations, at values subsequently determined to be inflated. Vesco, in other words, was charging that Casey, the Glory Forgan crew, and their other colleagues in Multiponics had committed fraud against iOS. Intriguingly, Vesco's subsequent flight to Costa Rica, the beginning of his grand tour of the Caribbean and Latin America, occurred in February 1973, the same month that Casey resigned from the SEC. There was no evidence to suggest that the two events were related, although a subsequent grand jury found evidence that Casey's successor at the SEC, Bradford Cook, and Casey directly interfered with the SEC's investigation into Vesco and the iOS. Years later, an informant and U.S. Customs contract agent named Joe Kelso arrived in Costa Rica on the trail of a fugitive drug dealer. While he never found his target, Kelso did discover Vesco's private jet tucked away inside a hangar paid for by a shrimp company called Frigoríficos de Punta Arenas. Frigoríficos was, as stated in a CIA Inspector General's report, among the companies that were used by the Department of State in the mid-1980s to channel humanitarian aid to the Contras. The report goes on to acknowledge that the company and its operators, Frank Chains and Moises Nunez, the latter a narcotics officer in the government of Costa Rica, were linked to the international transport of cocaine and the laundering of drug money, per U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA reports. The Kerry Committee report, meanwhile, further identified Ramon Million Rodriguez, a money launderer tied to the Colombia cartels, and Luis Rodriguez, a convicted narcotics trafficker as other frigoríficos principals. That Vesco would appear in direct proximity to Colombian narcotics traffickers is not surprising. In the early 1980s, drug smuggler George Young testified that Carlos later, a high-level trafficker from the Medellin drug cartel, had partnered with Robert Vesco in moving cocaine through the Bahamas. Later confirmed Young's claim. When he was called to testify in the 1991 trial against Manuel Noriega, later identified Vesco as one of his partners in the Bahamas since the early 1980s. Good grief, God. Good grief, God. I am going to call it right here because, again, I still got 50 more pages in a very dense chapter like this. There's so much. I'm going to call it right here and pick up the next part of this chapter on Monday. There is a lot going on in this private CIA. And it was left unchecked practically, which is what we're going to have going on right now. With that, I'm going to call the reading off for today and pick it up on Monday. Hopefully you enjoyed this reading of so much and have a good night. And with that, see you in the next live reading.